Welcome back, everyone. Get ready, because today we're going to step into the scene of a 40-year-old psychological crime case. The relationship between Marlon Brando and Tarita Teriipaia was never a romance. It was a massacre of fame. The moment the cameras went off in Mutiny on the Bounty, the Godfather didn't marry a wife. He kidnapped a soul. Brando ruthlessly crushed Tarita's burgeoning career, exiled her to a deserted island, and turned her into a saint in a glass cage. Why? So that whenever he grew weary of the depraved debauchery of Hollywood, he would have a pure being to return to for purification. Tarita wasn't a lover. She was a living sacrifice to the megalomaniacal ego of a rotten man. And to secure that sacrifice, Brando didn't use force. He used a warning disguised as protection. He looked at her and said, "Hollywood destroys people, Tarita. I won't let it destroy you." He told her she was returning to Tahiti, to the private atoll he had purchased called Tetiaroa. "You will be safe there," he promised. "You will stay pure for me." It sounded like love. But as Brando stood up to leave her there, remaining in the luxury of Los Angeles himself, the truth was clear. He had successfully secured his artifact. He would ship her back to the museum case in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, where she would remain frozen in time. The movie was over. The captivity had begun. But this captivity was not defined by iron bars or armed guards. It was defined by a terrifying quietness, a void where a young woman's dreams were slowly replaced by the sound of the wind. The silence of Tetiaroa was not the peaceful silence of a library or a cathedral. It was the indifferent, crushing silence of the prehistoric world. When the sun went down over the 12 islets that formed Marlon Brando's private kingdom, the darkness was absolute. There were no streetlights to push back the night, no hum of distant traffic to remind a lonely soul that humanity still existed somewhere over the horizon. There was only the sound of the wind rattling the palm fronds, a sound that, to Tarita Teriipaia in those early months of 1963, sounded less like a lullaby and more like the whispering of ghosts. She was living in the dream that Brando had constructed. But she was slowly realizing that a dream, when enforced upon another person, becomes a hallucination. Brando had sold her the island as a sanctuary, a garden of Eden, where they could raise their son Tehotu, away from the radioactive decay of Western culture. But the operational reality of this sanctuary was designed with the precision of a penal colony. The isolation was not merely geographical, it was informational. Brando controlled the radio. He controlled the boat schedules. He controlled the flow of money. Tarita, a woman who had once navigated the bustling markets of Papeete and danced for tourists in hotels, found herself reduced to a singular function: waiting. She was the keeper of the flame, maintaining the spiritual purity of the household while the master was away, engaging in the very vices he claimed to despise. The most brutal weapon in Brando's arsenal during this period was not physical violence, but the systematic destruction of Tarita's potential. The year 1963 should have been her coronation. The performance she had given in Mutiny on the Bounty had resonated with audiences not because of her technique, but because of her profound, undeniable presence. She possessed a raw emotional transparency that actors spend decades in drama school trying to manufacture. The Hollywood Foreign Press Association recognized this brilliance, granting her a nomination for a Golden Globe. This was the moment that usually defines a life. It is the moment when the world opens its arms and says, "You belong here." But Brando intercepted this validation like a censor in a totalitarian regime. He did not hide the nomination from her entirely. That would have been too simple. Instead, he reframed it. He twisted the context until the honor looked like an insult. He sat her down, his face heavy with that practiced, weary concern, and explained that the nomination was not a recognition of her talent, but a fetishization of her race. "They don't think you're a good actress, Tita," he would say, using his nickname for her, his voice low and hypnotic. "They think you're a cute little pet. If you go to that ceremony, they will laugh at you. They will make you wear their clothes and speak their language, and when you make a mistake, they will destroy you." He played on her deepest insecurities, her lack of formal education, her shaky English, her fear of the complex social etiquette of the white world. A supportive husband would have hired a tutor, a translator, a stylist. He would have stood beside her and used his immense power to shield her. Brando did the opposite. He magnified the threat. He turned the Golden Globe into a poisoned chalice. He convinced her that staying on the island, barefoot and hidden, was the only way to maintain her dignity. And so, the night the awards were handed out in Los Angeles, Tarita was thousands of miles away, perhaps looking up at the stars over the lagoon, wondering what it would have felt like to hold that gold statue, while Brando breathed a sigh of relief that his bird had not learned to fly. The hypocrisy of this protection was staggering when placed against the backdrop of Brando's own life in Hollywood during the mid-1960s. While he demanded that Tarita live like a monk in the tropics to avoid the contamination of the West, Brando was immersing himself in the counterculture explosion of Los Angeles. He was sexually voracious, engaging in multiple overlapping relationships, fathering children with other women, and exploring his own neuroses through endless hours of therapy. He wanted Tarita to remain static, a fixed point of reference, while he was allowed to be dynamic, chaotic, and experimental. He treated her purity not as a virtue to be cherished, but as a resource to be hoarded, a battery he could plug himself into whenever his own charge ran low. When he did bring her to Los Angeles for brief visits, usually hidden away in his house on Mulholland Drive, far from the prying eyes of the press he claimed to hate, yet constantly courted, the enforcement of the noble savage archetype became humiliatingly specific. There is a particular cruelty in dating a woman because she is natural, and then forcing her to perform that naturalness as a theatrical act. Brando developed an obsessive aversion to Tarita adopting any Western affectations. One afternoon, in preparation for a rare dinner with some of Brando's acquaintances, Tarita tried to dress the part of a movie star's wife. She bought a pair of elegant shoes. She styled her hair in a French twist, exposing her long, graceful neck. She applied a touch of eyeliner to accentuate her dark eyes. She looked in the mirror and saw a woman who was bridging the gap between her two worlds, a woman who was trying to grow. When she walked into the living room, Brando did not compliment her. He stopped dead, his face contorting into a mask of disgust. To him, she didn't look beautiful. She looked spoiled. She looked like she was assimilating. "Take that off," he ordered, the softness of the lover replaced by the cold command of the director. "You look ridiculous. You look like you're trying to be Gabor." He made her scrub her face. He made her take down her hair until it hung wild and loose. He made her take off the shoes. He wanted her barefoot. He paraded her in front of his friends in a pareo, presenting her not as his equal, but as his discovery. "Look at her," he would say to his guests, gesturing to the humiliated woman sitting silently in the corner. "She doesn't know anything about politics or money. She just knows how to live. She is real." It was a performance of authenticity, a staged primitive state. Tarita was no longer a person. She was a prop in Brando's one-man show about how much he hated civilization. He was using her body to make a political statement. By denying her the right to wear shoes, he was denying her the right to walk through the world on her own terms. He was literally and metaphorically keeping her unequipped to navigate the concrete of the city. He kept her soft-footed so she could only survive on the sand. This period was also defined by the contract shredder phase of their relationship. The studios, particularly Universal, were persistent. They saw the rushes from Mutiny. They saw the dailies. They knew that Tarita had a quality that could sell tickets. They sent scripts to Brando's office addressed to her. They made offers that would have secured her financial independence for life. Brando did not just decline these offers. He obliterated them. He acted as her unauthorized agent, telling the studios that she had retired, that she hated acting, that she wanted nothing to do with them. He never showed her the scripts. He never told her the dollar amounts. He made executive decisions about her life without her consent, justifying it with the paternalistic lie that he knew what was best for her. "You wouldn't like it, Tita," he would tell her later when she asked why the phone never rang for her. "It's boring. You have to wait around in trailers all day. You have to talk to idiots. You're better off here. You're free here." Free. He used that word constantly. But his definition of freedom for Tarita was indistinguishable from captivity. Freedom, in Brando's lexicon, meant freedom from the corruption of the West, but it came at the cost of freedom of choice. He was like a man who captures a wild bird and puts it in a cage, then tells the bird, "I am keeping you in here so the hawks don't get you. You are free from the hawks." He didn't understand that the cage was the greater tragedy. The marriage itself, which finally took place, was shrouded in this same secrecy and control. It wasn't a celebration of union. It was a legal maneuver. Brando married Tarita largely to secure custody and control over their children and to prevent immigration issues from separating him from his possession. There were no wedding photos released to the press. There was no honeymoon in Paris. It was a transaction. By making her his wife, he legally solidified his role as her guardian. In the 1960s, the power dynamic in a marriage between a wealthy, white American man and a young Polynesian woman was absolute. He held the passports. He held the bank accounts. He held the keys to the kingdom. As the late 1960s approached, Brando's career began to wobble. Films like The Ugly American and A Countess from Hong Kong failed to ignite the box office. The critics began to turn on him, calling himself indulgent and difficult. As his professional power waned, his need to exert control over his private world intensified. He became more paranoid, more rigid about the rules of Tetiaroa. He began to view the island not just as a sanctuary, but as a fortress against a world that was ceasing to worship him. And Tarita was the prisoner in the tower. She began to notice the cracks in his armor. She saw the way he ate, compulsively, emotionally, consuming entire chickens, gallons of ice cream, trying to fill a void that fame could not touch. She saw the way he looked at other women, the way his eyes would wander even when he was holding her hand. She realized that his obsession with her purity was not about her, it was about his own guilt. He felt dirty, so he needed her to be clean. He felt lost, so he needed her to be found. He was using her soul as a frantic attempt to launder his own. But the most devastating realization for Tarita was that she was beginning to forget who she was before Marlon Brando. The girl from Bora Bora who danced and laughed was fading, replaced by this silent, watchful woman who waited for the plane. She was forgetting the rhythm of the toere drums, replaced by the rhythm of Brando's moods. She was losing her language, her spark, her agency. She was becoming exactly what he wanted, a reflection, a mirror that showed him a version of himself he desperately wanted to believe in, the benevolent protector, the king of the island. One night alone in the bungalow on Tetiaroa, while a tropical storm raged outside, shaking the walls of the fragile house, Tarita looked at her sleeping son, Tehotu. She realized that the isolation was doing something to him too. He was growing up in a vacuum. He didn't know how to play with other children because there were no other children. He didn't know about the world beyond the reef. Brando was conducting a social experiment, and her children were the lab rats. He wanted to see if he could raise a perfect human being, untouched by society. But Tarita knew, with the instinct of a mother, that a child raised in a jar cannot survive when the glass eventually breaks. And the glass would break. It had to. Because the outside world was not just out there, it was encroaching. Brando's fame was a magnet that attracted chaos, and no amount of ocean could keep it at bay forever. But for now, in the long, humid stretch of the mid-60s, the cage was secure. Tarita was the secret wife, the hidden gem, the invisible woman. The world thought she was living a fairy tale, but she was living a paradox. She was the wife of the most famous man on earth, yet she was the loneliest woman in the world. This loneliness was about to become even more acute. While Tarita remained frozen in Brando's amber, the world outside was accelerating into a new era of chaos and revolution, leaving her further behind on the shores of time. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the world outside Tetiaroa was setting itself on fire. The Vietnam War was raging. The Manson family murders had shattered the illusion of hippie innocence in Los Angeles, and the civil rights movement was reshaping the soul of America. The cultural tectonic plates were shifting violently. But on Marlon Brando's private atoll, time had curdled. The air was thick not just with humidity, but with a stagnation that felt almost deliberate. Brando had succeeded in building his fortress of solitude, but he had forgotten that a fortress, by definition, is designed to keep things out, which means it also keeps its inhabitants locked in. Tarita Teriipaia was now in her mid-20s. The girl who had been plucked from the hotel kitchen was gone, replaced by a woman whose face was beginning to show the subtle, erosive marks of chronic loneliness. She was raising 2 children now, Tehotu and the newly born Cheyenne, in an environment that was visually paradisiacal but psychologically barren. Tetiaroa was beautiful, yes. The lagoon was a piercing, impossible turquoise. The sand was white powder, but beauty without witness, beauty without shared experience, eventually becomes oppressive. Tarita was living in a postcard that no one else could read. Her daily existence was a loop of primitive domesticity enforced by a millionaire absent husband. She fished, she cooked, she wove, she waited. The infrastructure of the island was kept intentionally rustic. Brando in his visits would preach about the virtues of living close to the earth. He decried the evils of air conditioning, of television, of processed food. It was easy for him to romanticize the lack of plumbing when he spent 8 months of the year in the luxury hotels of Beverly Hills or on film sets with 5-star catering trailers. For Tarita, the lack of modern amenities wasn't a philosophical statement. It was just hard labor. She was washing clothes by hand not because she was a noble savage, but because her husband, one of the richest actors in the world, refused to install a washing machine in the name of purity. The double standard was no longer just a crack in the facade. It was the entire foundation of their marriage. In 1972, Brando's career, which had been in a decade-long death spiral, suddenly resurrected with the force of a nuclear explosion. The Godfather. The role of Don Vito Corleone changed everything. Brando was no longer just a star. He was a legend. He was the center of the cinematic universe again. The acclaim was deafening. He won the Oscar. Then came Last Tango in Paris, a film so sexually explicit and raw that it scandalized the world and cemented Brando's reputation as a fearless artistic genius. But while Brando was simulating anal sex on screen in Paris and exploring the darkest corners of human desire for millions to see, he was simultaneously tightening the leash on Tarita's sexuality and freedom. He forbade her from even looking at other men. He monitored her behavior with a paranoid intensity. He treated her fidelity as the only anchor in his chaotic life. While Brando was in Paris filming scenes of intense eroticism and living a life of absolute bohemian freedom, sleeping with co-stars and debating philosophy in cafes, Tarita was sitting on an atoll in the Pacific, forbidden from leaving, forbidden from working, forbidden from even wearing lipstick because it might signal availability. He needed her to be the Virgin Mary so he could be the Marquis de Sade. It was during this era that Tarita began to understand the true nature of her protection. Brando wasn't protecting her from the world. He was hiding her from the evidence of his own life. If she came to Hollywood, she would see the mistresses. She would see the chaos. She would see that the man who demanded absolute loyalty from her was incapable of it himself. One of the most harrowing aspects of this time was the gaslighting. When Tarita would complain about the isolation, about the boredom, about the desire to see a city or go to a cinema, Brando would turn it back on her. He would use his immense intellect and verbal dexterity to twist her reality. "You don't know how lucky you are, Tita," he would say, his voice heavy with that seductive, weary authority. "Out there, people are miserable. They are slaves to their jobs. They are slaves to money. Here, you are free. You are a queen. Why do you want to be a slave?" He made her feel guilty for wanting normal human connection. He made her feel that her desire for civilization was a moral failing, a sign that she was becoming corrupted. He convinced her that her loneliness was actually a form of spiritual privilege that she was too ungrateful to appreciate. And then there were the children. The tragedy of the Brando legacy began to incubate in the 1970s. Brando had decided that his children with Tarita, Tehotu, and Cheyenne would be raised as true Tahitians. He did not want them to be Americanized. He did not want them to be Brandoized. On the surface, this sounds like a respect for their heritage. In practice, it was a form of developmental sabotage. He forbade them from visiting the United States. He restricted their education. He wanted them to grow up innocent, close to nature, unburdened by the neuroses of the West. But innocence, when enforced by a blockade, becomes ignorance. Cheyenne, in particular, was a bright, sensitive child who felt the weight of her father's shadow even from thousands of miles away. She knew her father was a god to the world, but to her, he was a distant, booming voice on a radio or a terrifying presence that descended from the sky in a plane every few months. Brando loved them, yes, but he loved them like a gardener loves rare orchids. He kept them in a greenhouse. He didn't realize that by protecting them from the bacteria of the real world, he was preventing them from developing an immune system. He was raising them to be aliens on their own planet. They didn't fit in with the local Tahitians, who saw them as the rich, privileged children of the American movie star. And they didn't fit in with the Americans because they were kept ignorant of American culture. They were stranded in the middle, in a cultural limbo created by their father's ego. As Cheyenne grew older, she began to ask questions. She wanted to know about her father's other life. She wanted to know about her half-siblings. She wanted to see Los Angeles. Brando's reaction was always fear disguised as anger. "No," he would tell her, "you stay here. You are a princess of the island. The world out there is ugly." He was terrified that if his pure children entered his dirty world, they would be contaminated. Or worse, they would judge him. He wanted to keep his two lives completely separate. He wanted to be the debauched Hollywood icon in Los Angeles and the benevolent patriarch in Tahiti. He didn't want the streams to cross, but water always finds a way. In the mid-70s, the cracks in the dam began to widen. Tarita, pushed to the brink by boredom and loneliness, began to quietly rebel. It wasn't a loud rebellion. She didn't scream or throw plates. She just began to withdraw. She stopped waiting by the radio. She stopped dressing up for his arrivals. She began to build a wall of indifference around her heart. Brando sensed it. He sensed her drifting away, and it panicked him. His control relied on her emotional dependence. If she stopped needing him, his power evaporated. He tried to woo her back with grand gestures. He promised to build a hotel on the island, an eco-resort that would bring visitors, bring life, bring a purpose to her days. He spun a vision of a scientific sanctuary where the greatest minds of the world would come to study the ecology of the atoll. Tarita listened, but she no longer believed. She had heard the speeches before. She looked at the man who had played the Godfather, the man who could manipulate audiences with a twitch of his eyebrow. And she realized he was doing the same thing to her. He was acting. He was selling a script that would never be filmed. The hotel project became another form of purgatory. Construction started, stalled, and dragged on. It brought noise and dust to the island, but no real connection to the world. It was Brando's folly, a chaotic, disorganized attempt to play God with the landscape, just as he played God with his family. By the late 1970s, the paradise of Tetiaroa had curdled into a humid, mosquito-infested prison of broken promises. Tarita was no longer the young girl in the sarong. She was a woman approaching 30, looking at her reflection in the lagoon and wondering where her life had gone. She had traded her youth for a myth. She had traded her potential for a man who was never there. And in the background, unnoticed by Brando in his arrogance, the tragedy of Cheyenne was beginning to take root. The little girl who was forbidden from seeing the world was beginning to look at the horizon with a dangerous hunger. She didn't want to be safe anymore. She wanted to burn. And Brando, in his obsession with keeping the fire out, had forgotten that spontaneous combustion starts from the inside. That internal fire smoldered for years, hidden beneath the canopy of paradise, until the dawn of a new decade exposed the rot that had infested the very foundation of Brando's dream. As the 1980s dawned, the sun rose over Tetiaroa, not on a pristine Eden, but on a kingdom in a state of slow, humid decay. The palm trees still swayed, and the lagoon still shimmered with that impossible jewel-toned blue, but the human element of the island, the utopia Marlon Brando had promised to build, was rotting from the inside out. The eco-hotel Brando had commissioned, a project intended to be a beacon of sustainability and a sanctuary for the world's intelligentsia, had become a chaotic money pit. The bungalows were constantly under assault from the salt air and the termites. The infrastructure was failing, and in the middle of this dilapidation stood Tarita Teriipaia, no longer the 19-year-old muse, but a woman approaching 40, burdened with the administrative chaos of running a resort that was designed by a man who didn't believe in management. Tarita was ostensibly the manageress of the hotel. It sounds like a promotion, a move toward independence. In reality, it was a shift in servitude. She was no longer just the keeper of his home, she was the keeper of his failing business. She spent her days organizing staff, dealing with broken generators, and greeting the few tourists who made the trek to the famous actor's private island. These tourists would look at her with a mixture of curiosity and pity. They came hoping to see the glamorous wife of the Godfather. Instead, they found a tired woman in a pareo, struggling to keep the lights on in a paradise that was slowly being reclaimed by the jungle. But the physical decay of the hotel was nothing compared to the psychological erosion taking place within the family unit. The bubble Brando had constructed to protect his children was about to burst, and the explosion would be triggered by his daughter, Cheyenne. If Tarita was the silent victim of Brando's control, Cheyenne Brando was the volatile reaction. Born in 1970, Cheyenne was the genetic collision of two opposing worlds. She possessed her mother's breathtaking Polynesian beauty, the dark, liquid eyes, the long hair, the natural grace. But beneath the surface, she carried her father's brooding intensity, his erratic temperament, and his profound, bottomless melancholy. Brando adored Cheyenne. She was his precious jewel, but his love for her was suffocating, paranoid, and ultimately destructive. He had raised her on the island with the specific intent of keeping her ignorant of the world. He denied her a formal Western education because he believed schools were factories for conformity. He forbade her from visiting him in the United States because he believed America was a cultural cancer. "You are a princess," he would tell her, stroking her hair. "You don't need to go out there. Everything you need is here." But a teenager cannot live on coconuts and paternal platitudes. By the early 1980s, Cheyenne was suffocating. She was intelligent, artistic, and deeply bored. She listened to the radio, catching fragments of a world she was forbidden to enter. She knew her father was a god out there, and she couldn't understand why she was being kept in the dark. The hypocrisy of the captor reached its zenith with Cheyenne. Brando wanted her to be pure, yet his own absence created a void that she filled with rebellion. He would fly into Tetiaroa, overweight and exhausted from his Hollywood excesses, and lecture her on the virtues of simplicity. Then he would leave, and Cheyenne would be left alone with a mother who had been trained to be submissive. Tarita watched her daughter unravel with a sense of helpless dread. She saw the signs. Cheyenne was moody. She was prone to fits of rage that mirrored Brando's own legendary temper. She began to experiment with drugs, marijuana at first, then harder substances that drifted into the islands through the tourist trade. Tarita tried to warn Brando. "She needs to see the world, Marlon," she would plead during their erratic phone calls on the ham radio. "She is lonely. She is angry." Brando's response was always the same: "Lock the doors tighter. Don't let her leave," he would command from his mansion on Mulholland Drive. "She's not ready. The world will eat her alive." He didn't realize that his prophecy was self-fulfilling. By keeping her immune system naive, he was ensuring that when the virus of the real world finally hit her, it would be lethal. The inevitable escape happened in the mid-80s. Cheyenne, driven by a desperate need for validation and identity, defied her father. She left the island. She went to Tahiti, and then inevitably, she looked toward the very industry her father loathed, modeling. She was stunning. The camera loved her just as it had loved her mother. But unlike Tarita, who was naturally indifferent to fame, Cheyenne was hungry for it. She wanted to be seen. She wanted to prove to her father and to the world that she existed. But she was woefully ill-equipped for the Shark Tank of the fashion industry. She had no skin thick enough to deflect criticism. She had no social skills to navigate the politics of rejection. When she traveled to Paris or Milan, she wasn't a professional model. She was a wounded bird thrown into a turbine. The press descended on her. They didn't see a young girl trying to find her way. They saw Marlon Brando's daughter. They scrutinized her weight. They dissected her face. They asked her invasive questions about her reclusive father. Cheyenne cracked. The drug use escalated. The mood swings became psychotic breaks. And Brando, watching from a distance, did not offer support. He offered, "I told you so." "I told you the world was evil," he would say, validating his own paranoia while ignoring the fact that he had sent her out into that battle without any armor. He blamed the modeling agencies. He blamed the boyfriends. He blamed the drug dealers. He never blamed the isolation. He never blamed the fact that he had raised a girl to be a noble savage in a world that had no place for such archetypes. The physical manifestation of this crash came in 1989. Cheyenne was involved in a horrific car accident in Tahiti. She was driving a Jeep, lost control, and flipped it. She suffered severe head injuries and disfiguring scars on her face. For a young woman whose entire sense of self-worth had been tied to her beauty because that was the only currency her father valued, the scars were a psychological death sentence. Her modeling career was over. Her beauty was marred. She spiraled into a deep chemical depression. Tarita flew to her daughter's side, but she found herself powerless. She was fighting a two-front war, trying to save a daughter who didn't want to live, and trying to appease a husband who was using the accident as proof of his own twisted wisdom. "See," Brando said, "I told you she shouldn't have left the island." He didn't see a tragedy. He saw vindication. He used the accident to reassert control. He wanted Cheyenne back on Tetiaroa, back in the cage, where he could hide her scars and her shame from the world. It was during this dark period that the shadow of Christian Brando began to loom over the family. Christian was Brando's eldest son from his first marriage to Anna Cashby. If Cheyenne was the victim of isolation, Christian was the victim of chaos. He had been raised in the crossfire of one of the most vicious custody battles in Hollywood history. He had been kidnapped by his mother, retrieved by private investigators, neglected by his father, and raised by nannies. He was a man-child brimming with anger, loyalty, and a dangerous lack of impulse control. Brando loved Christian too, but in a different way. He saw Christian as his soldier. He bonded with his son over guns, over tough guy posturing, over a shared hatred of the system. When Cheyenne, broken and scarred, began to confide in her half-brother Christian, a lethal dynamic was formed. Cheyenne complained to Christian about her boyfriend, Dag Drolle. Dag was a prominent Tahitian, the scion of a wealthy political family. He and Cheyenne had a tumultuous relationship. They were both young, both troubled, and their arguments were fierce. Cheyenne, in her mentally unstable state, began to tell Christian that Dag was beating her. Whether these allegations were true, exaggerated, or the fabrications of a troubled mind remains a subject of debate. But to Christian Brando, a man raised on violence, desperate to be his father's hero, desperate to protect his little princess sister, the nuance didn't matter. He saw a villain, and he knew what Brando's did to villains. Tarita saw the storm gathering. She saw Christian arriving in Tahiti, his eyes hard, his demeanor aggressive. She saw the way he looked at Dag. She felt the tension in the air, thick as the humidity before a cyclone. She tried to mediate. She tried to calm the waters. But she was a woman whose voice had been systematically silenced for 30 years. When she spoke, the men in her family, her husband, her stepson, didn't listen. To them, she was just the island wife, the passive observer. They didn't realize she was the Cassandra of Tetiaroa, predicting the fire that was about to consume them all. By early 1990, the situation was untenable. Cheyenne was pregnant with Dog's child. Brando, in a rare moment of family unification, decided to bring everyone together in Los Angeles. This was the ultimate hypocrisy. For decades, he had kept Tarita and Cheyenne away from Mulholland Drive, claiming it was toxic. Now, with his family in crisis, he summoned them to the very belly of the beast. Tarita arrived in Los Angeles in May 1990. It was a city she had always been told to fear. She walked into the sprawling, gloomy mansion on Mulholland Drive, a house that felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum of Brando's memorabilia. The atmosphere in the house was poisonous. Brando was there, massive and immobile, holding court in his bedroom, watching TV endlessly, eating ice cream by the gallon. Christian was there, pacing, drinking, cleaning his guns. Cheyenne was there, pregnant, erratic, whispering accusations into Christian's ear. Dagdrola was there, trying to make peace, trying to be a father to his unborn child, unaware that he had walked into a trap. Tarita felt the danger. She urged Brando to intervene. "There is too much anger here, Marlon," she said. "Christian is dangerous. Dog is scared." Brando waved her away. "Let the boys handle it," he mumbled. "Christian's just being a big brother." He was disengaged. He was the director who had lost control of his set but refused to call cut. He thought he could manage the violence of his children just as he had managed the violence of his characters on screen. He thought he was the Godfather, capable of dispensing justice and order with a wave of his hand. He was wrong. He wasn't the Godfather. He was King Lear, blind and mad, presiding over a kingdom he had destroyed with his own vanity. On the night of May 16th, 1990, the television was blaring in the background. The Santa Ana winds were blowing hot and dry through the canyons. Tarita went to bed with a heavy heart, a feeling of doom pressing on her chest. Down the hall, in the den, Christian Brando sat with a .45 caliber handgun. Dag Drolle sat on the sofa, watching TV. The collision of Brando's two worlds, the violent, chaotic West and the exploited, fragile paradise, was about to end in a gunshot that would shatter the silence of Tetiaroa forever. The hypocritical captor had brought all his victims under one roof, and the tragedy he had spent a lifetime trying to avoid was now sitting in his living room, holding a loaded gun. In that suffocating room, 30 years of repression, lies, and conflicting worlds finally reached their breaking point. The trigger was pulled, and the silence was broken forever. The gunshot that rang out at 12,900 Mulholland Drive on the night of May 16, 1990, was not merely the sound of a bullet leaving a chamber. It was the sound of a 30-year-old glass house shattering. It was the sonic boom of Marlon Brando's carefully compartmentalized worlds colliding with lethal force. For decades, he had tried to keep the savage purity of Tahiti separate from the corrupt violence of America. He had kept his island wife and daughter hidden away, safe from the pollution of his reality. But in a single, deafening second, the violence didn't come from the outside world. It came from within the sanctuary itself. Tarita Teriipaia was in the guest room, drifting in the uneasy sleep of the worried, when the noise tore through the silence of the canyon. It was a flat, ugly crack, the unmistakable sound of metal striking finality. She ran down the hallway. The scene she encountered in the den was a tableau of horror that no amount of Hollywood desensitization could prepare a mother for. Dog Drolet, the father of her unborn grandchild, the man she had welcomed into her family, was slumped on the sofa. He wasn't breathing. The television was still flickering, casting a blue, ghostly light over the spreading pool of dark blood. Standing over him was Christian Brando, the protector, the soldier son. He looked bewildered, a child who had broken a toy and couldn't understand why it wouldn't work anymore. And then the patriarch arrived. Marlon Brando lumbered into the room. The man who had played the Godfather, the man who had simulated violence in 100 films, was now faced with the wet, warm reality of it. What happened next was a grotesque parody of his cinematic legacy. Brando didn't call the police immediately. He tried to direct the scene. He knelt beside Dog. He checked for a pulse. He tried to perform mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. It was a grotesque tableau, the most famous face in the world, pressing his lips to the dying boy from Tahiti, trying to breathe life back into a body that his own son had destroyed. He was trying to edit the footage in real time. He wanted a retake, but death does not take direction. When the realization hit that Dog was gone, that the script had run out, Brando slumped back. He looked at Tarita. In that moment, the king of Tetiaroa was naked. His philosophy, his control, his walls, they were all useless. He had promised to keep them safe. He had brought them to this fortress to solve a family dispute, and instead, he had presided over an execution. The 911 call was made. The sirens began to wail up the canyon roads. The flashing lights cut through the darkness, illuminating the private hell they had built. For Tarita, the arrival of the police was the final violation. The outside world, the sewer Brando had spent a lifetime warning her about, was now marching through her front door with badges and guns. But they weren't the villains. The villain was standing in the living room, holding the smoking gun. The days following the murder were a blur of flashbulbs and microphones. The media siege that Brando had spent his life avoiding now camped permanently at his gates. Helicopters hovered over the lawn. Reporters climbed trees to get a glimpse of the tragedy. For Tarita, this was the ultimate exposure. For 30 years, she had been the secret wife, the ghost of the Pacific. Now, her face was plastered on every tabloid cover in the world. But the narrative wasn't about her grace or her beauty anymore. It was about her tragedy. She was the mother of the grieving pregnant girlfriend. She was the stepmother of the murderer. She was the silent witness to the carnage of the Brando dynasty. Brando retreated into a mode of frantic, manipulative survival. He hired the best defense attorneys money could buy. He leveraged every ounce of his fame to protect Christian. He painted the narrative. It was an accident, a struggle over a gun, a tragedy, yes, but not a murder. But in doing so, he had to sacrifice someone, and that someone was Cheyenne. To save his son from the gas chamber, the defense strategy required painting Dog Drolet as abusive. They needed to justify Christian's rage. They needed to show that Christian was protecting his sister from a monster. This meant that Cheyenne, the fragile, mentally unstable pregnant girl, became the fulcrum of the legal battle. She was the witness. She was the cause. She was the problem. Tarita watched as her husband, the man who claimed to love their daughter above all else, allowed his lawyers to tear apart the memory of Dog, the man Cheyenne loved, in order to save Christian. It was a Sophie's choice made in a lawyer's office. Brando chose the son. He chose the Brando bloodline over the Tahitian interloper. Cheyenne shattered. She had lost her lover. Her brother was in jail. Her father was rewriting history to save his own reputation. The pressure on her psyche was catastrophic. She stopped eating. She sat in the dark, rocking back and forth, speaking to people who weren't there. Brando's solution to this mental health crisis was typical of the hypocritical captor. He decided to export the problem. He knew that if Cheyenne testified in court, she would be unpredictable. She might tell the truth, that the shooting wasn't an accident, that Christian had marched in with intent. Her testimony could send Christian to prison for life. So Brando arranged for Cheyenne to leave the country. He flew her back to Tahiti. He claimed it was for her health to have the baby in peace. But the legal authorities saw it for what it was. He was hiding the witness. He was shipping the evidence back to the island where U.S. subpoenas had no power. Once again, Tarita was tasked with being the jailer. She was sent back to Tahiti with a broken daughter, instructed to keep her quiet, keep her hidden, and keep her alive. Back in Los Angeles, the trial of Christian Brando became the spectacle of the decade. And Marlon Brando gave the performance of his life. He took the stand. He didn't wear a tuxedo this time. He wore a suit that looked slightly too big, making him appear smaller, older, more vulnerable. He cried. He rambled. He told the court, "I think I failed as a father." The world watched a broken giant. They saw a man seemingly crushed by the weight of his own legend. But Tarita, watching the reports from Tahiti, saw something else. She saw the actor. She saw the man who knew exactly when to let the tear fall. She knew that his admission of failure was strategic. By blaming himself, he was taking the heat off Christian. By playing the tragic King Lear, he was manipulating the jury's emotions. He testified about how he tried to raise his children right, about how he tried to keep them pure. He spoke about the island as if it were a church and the gun as if it were a serpent that had slithered into the garden. He never mentioned the isolation. He never mentioned the years of neglect. He never mentioned that Christian had been raised on a diet of guns and anger, or that Cheyenne had been raised on a diet of loneliness and repression. He painted the picture of a loving family struck by random lightning, not a family that had been standing on a lightning rod for 30 years. The strategy worked. Christian Brando took a plea deal, voluntary manslaughter, 10 years. He would be out in 5. Brando had bought his son's life with millions of dollars and a brilliant acting performance. But the cost was the sanity of his daughter. Back in Tahiti, Cheyenne gave birth to a son, Tuki. But the birth did not bring joy. It brought a new level of darkness. Cheyenne was no longer just depressed. She was psychotic. She began to hallucinate. She believed that Brando was the devil. She believed that her father was trying to kill her. She would call Tarita in the middle of the night, screaming that there were demons in the room. The French authorities in Tahiti, unlike the star-struck police in L.A., were not charmed by the Brando name. They wanted to question Cheyenne. They considered her an accomplice to the murder. They demanded she stay in Tahiti. Brando from Los Angeles tried to control the treatment of his daughter via telephone. He didn't trust the French doctors. He wanted to move her to a private clinic in the U.S. or keep her on Tetiaroa under his own supervision. He believed in his supreme arrogance that only he could cure her. He believed that his love was more powerful than schizophrenia. She just needs rest, he would tell Tarita. She needs the island. But the island was haunted now. Every palm tree reminded Cheyenne of the prison her father had built. Every wave sounded like the static of the television in the room where Dog died. Tarita found herself in the most impossible position of her life. She was the buffer between a mad daughter and a controlling, delusional father. She had to physically restrain Cheyenne from hurting herself. She had to hide the pills. She had to watch her daughter, who was once the most beautiful girl in the Pacific, deteriorate into an unrecognizable shadow. Cheyenne made multiple suicide attempts. She took tranquilizers. She tried to hang herself with a dog leash. Each time, Brando would intervene from afar, sending doctors, sending money, sending orders. But he wouldn't come. He stayed in Los Angeles, hiding in his mansion, eating himself into oblivion. He couldn't face the wreckage. He couldn't look at Cheyenne because when he looked at her, he saw the failure of his entire philosophy. He saw that the noble savage he tried to create had become a broken doll. The final act of the captor took place in the realm of custody. As Cheyenne's mental state collapsed, the question arose, who would raise the baby, Tukey? Brando wanted the child. He wanted a do-over. He looked at Tukey, this innocent, beautiful boy, and he saw another chance to get it right. He wanted to bring Tukey to America, or raise him on Tetiaroa under the Brando banner. Tarita fought him. For the first time in 30 years, the submissive wife stood up. She looked at the man who had destroyed her life and the lives of her children, and she said, "No. You will not have him," she told him. "You destroyed Christian. You destroyed Cheyenne. You will not destroy Tukey." It was a war. Brando threatened to cut off her money. He threatened to use his lawyers to take the child. He used every weapon in the abuser's handbook: financial coercion, intimidation, emotional blackmail. "You are nothing without me," he would scream. "I made you. I can break you." But Tarita had nothing left to lose. She had already lost her youth. She was watching her daughter die by degrees. The only thing she had left that was the duty to protect the next generation from the curse of the Brando name. She realized finally that the man she had worshipped was not a god. He was a vampire. He fed on innocence. He needed fresh blood to sustain his own myth. But Tarita stood between him and her grandson. As the mid-90s approached, the situation in Tahiti became a death watch. Cheyenne was in and out of psychiatric hospitals. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia. She was heavily medicated. She was a ghost haunting the island of Tahiti, wandering the streets, telling strangers that her father was a murderer. Brando stopped visiting. The pain was too great, or perhaps the mirror was too clear. He stayed in the dark on Mulholland Drive, surrounded by his Oscars and his regrets, leaving Tarita alone to clean up the blood and the tears. The fairy tale was over. The horror movie was entering its final scene. But this final scene would not be played out in a courtroom or a hospital in Los Angeles. It would return to the source of the pain, to the island where the cage was first built, for one last heartbreaking act of defiance. The sun that rose over the lush, verdant mountains of Tahiti on Easter Sunday, April 16, 1995, did not bring with it the promise of resurrection. For the Brando family, it brought the final, crushing weight of a stone that had been rolling downhill for 30 years. The air in the Paranoia district was heavy with the scent of tropical flowers, a cloying sweetness that Tarita Teriipaia would forever associate with the worst day of her life. Inside the house, the silence was not peaceful. It was the held breath of a household that had been living in a state of emergency for half a decade. Cheyenne Brando, the princess of Tetiaroa, the girl who had been raised in a bubble to keep her safe from the world, was 25 years old. She had lost her lover to a bullet fired by her brother. She had lost her brother to a prison cell. She had lost her father to his own ego. And on this Holy Sunday, she decided she had lost enough of herself. Cheyenne had tried to leave before. The suicide attempts had been frequent, frantic cries for help that echoed across the ocean to the deaf ears of her father in Los Angeles. But this time, there was no cry. There was only a grim, quiet determination. While her mother was at church praying for a miracle that would never come, Cheyenne went to her bedroom. She did not use a gun, the weapon of her brother. She did not use pills, the weapon of the doctors her father didn't trust. She used a simple rope. She hanged herself in the home of her mother, the final act of a bird that realized the cage was not around her, but inside her. When Tarita returned and found her daughter, the scream that tore from her throat was not just a sound of grief, it was the sound of the entire illusion shattering. The noble savage experiment was over. The subject was dead. When the phone rang at the mansion on Mulholland Drive, Marlon Brando was alone. He was 71 years old, a man of immense physical bulk and even immense sorrow, hiding from the world in a house filled with the ghosts of his past. When he heard the news that his precious jewel, the daughter he had tried to mold into the perfect being, was gone, he collapsed. But he did not collapse into action. He collapsed into the final, impenetrable silence of the coward. The funeral of Cheyenne Brando took place in Tahiti. It was a somber, devastating affair. The local community who had watched this tragedy unfold for years gathered to mourn the girl who never had a chance. Tarita stood by the grave, a small, broken figure in black. She looked around the crowd, scanning the faces, looking for the one face that should have been there. She looked for the father. She looked for the man who had controlled every aspect of Cheyenne's life, the man who had dictated where she could live, who she could see, and what she could learn. But Marlon Brando was not there. He stayed in Los Angeles. He sent a message claiming that his presence would turn the funeral into a media circus. He claimed he was too ill, too heartbroken to travel. It was the ultimate, final hypocrisy. The man who had spent a lifetime claiming that he was the only one who could protect his family, the only one who truly loved them, refused to stand by their side when the worst happened. He let Tarita bury their daughter alone. He let her face the cameras, the whispers, and the dirt hitting the coffin by herself. In his absence, the truth was laid bare. Brando's control was never about protection. It was about possession. And now that the object of his possession was broken beyond repair, he discarded it. He could not face the grave because looking into it would be like looking into a mirror. He knew, deep in the dark recesses of his soul, that he had tied the knot just as surely as Cheyenne had. In the years that followed Cheyenne's death, a cold war settled over the relationship between Marlon and Tarita. The phone calls became infrequent. The visits stopped. Tarita Teriipaia, the woman who had spent her entire adult life as a satellite orbiting the planet of Marlon Brando, finally broke orbit. The death of her daughter had burned away the fear. It had burned away the awe. She looked at the man she had called God for 30 years and saw only a sad, manipulative old man. It was in this crucible of grief that Tarita did something forbidden. She began to write. For decades, Brando had enforced a strict code of silence. Never talk to the press. Never write about the family. Keep our secrets. It was the omerta of the Brando Mafia. But Tarita was no longer a member of the family. She was a survivor of it. She sat down and poured the agony of 40 years onto the page. She wrote about the seduction. She wrote about the isolation on the island. She wrote about the way he forbade her from growing, the way he crushed her career, the way he tried to play God with their children. She titled the book, Marlon, My Love, My Torment. It was not a hate letter. That would have been too simple. It was a tragedy. She admitted that she still loved him in the way a prisoner might love the only face they have seen for decades. But she also exposed him. She stripped away the myth of the great lover and revealed the terrified child beneath. She released the book only after his death, finally breaking the silence she had kept for decades. But even from the grave, Brando had the final word. When his will was read, Tarita discovered he had cut her out completely. The book became her only closure, a message sent to a man who was no longer there to hear it. He raged against her to his lawyers, but he could not stop the truth from getting out. The world finally heard the voice of the woman who had been silent since 1962. As the new millennium dawned, Marlon Brando began to fade. He became a phantom in his own life. He grew enormously obese, his health failing due to diabetes and pulmonary fibrosis. He spent his days in bed watching television, refusing to see old friends, refusing to acknowledge the world he had once conquered. He became a prisoner of his own making, locked in the very fortress he had built to keep others out. The irony was perfect and cruel. The man who had imprisoned his wife on an island was now imprisoned in his own body, in his own house, by his own paranoia. In 2004, the news broke that the Godfather was dying. For Tarita, there was no cinematic reconciliation, no tearful bedside apology. Real life offered no closure, only the end of a regime. Brando died on July 1st, 2004, leaving a chaotic estate that mapped his final grudges, disinheriting some children while acknowledging others. For Tarita, the inheritance was simple. The voice that had commanded and gaslighted her for 42 years was finally silent. Today, Tarita lives in Paranoia. Tetiaroa has transformed from a primitive outpost into the Brando, an exclusive eco-resort. Wealthy tourists now bask in Brando's vision, sipping cocktails in air-conditioned villas, unaware they are vacationing in what was once a penal colony for a lonely woman. But the true legacy lies with Tuki Brando, Cheyenne's son. Tarita fought Brando for custody and won, raising the boy away from his grandfather's suffocating influence. Tuki grew up to be a model and a doctor, defying the very path Brando had tried to enforce. He stands as Tarita's ultimate victory. She saved the grandson from the collector. This story was never a Hollywood romance. It was the anatomy of destruction. Brando didn't want a wife, he wanted a mirror. When Tarita tried to be a person, he punished her. The actor who played the liberator on screen was an oppressor at home, using his genius to cast a shadow that nearly extinguished his family. Ultimately, Tarita's survival is her revenge. She outlived the cage. She outlived the jailer. The myth of Marlon Brando dissolves, leaving only Tarita standing, the survivor who finally outlasted the script. Marlon Brando was not the only giant who cast a long, dark shadow. The world is full of complicated figures, whose public image hides a private tragedy. We are here to find them. If this journey resonated with you, join us. Let us know in the comments which other forgotten souls or misunderstood villains we should bring into focus. Thank you for stepping into the past with us today.